Montana Territory, October 1881. The wind howled through the cottonwoods as the last light slipped behind the mountains, and in the shadowed barn behind a weather-beaten homestead, a woman curled against the hay, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders. Cold bit through the gaps in the wooden walls, but it was safer here than behind him. Her name was Beatrice Dunning, and she had come west 4 weeks ago as a mail-order bride. She had answered the ad in the St. Louis paper. Gentleman rancher, widowed, seeks wife of steady temperament. Children in need of mother's care. Room, board, and kind partnership promised. But nothing in that letter had been true. The man who met her off the train in Fort Benton, Harlan Crowder, was no gentleman. His house was not a home, but a shanty overrun with liquor bottles and fury. And his children had been gone for years, so he said, after drinking himself into a rage and grabbing her by the wrist hard enough to bruise. She had waited 2 nights, heart pounding, before slipping out with only her carpet bag and the clothes on her back. She had walked until her feet bled. Now, in the dark, she was alone, shivering in a stranger's barn. She had no idea whose land this was, but the fences were mended and the horses well fed. Whoever lived here was not like Harlan. The barn door creaked open. Beatrice sat up fast, heart galloping. A tall figure stepped inside, lantern in hand, casting a golden haze across the pale straw. He wore a long duster, the collar turned up against the wind, and his dark hair curled damp from the storm rolling in. He paused when he saw her, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. Not unkind, just surprised. "You lost?" he asked, voice low and steady. Beatrice stood slowly, clutching her carpet bag.
"No, sir.
Just passing through." "You always pass through people's barns at night?" She hesitated. "No." He stepped closer, the lantern light catching the gentleness in his eyes now. "You running from someone?" She swallowed hard. "Yes." He nodded once. "You hungry?" She blinked. "Yes." He held out a calloused hand. "Come on, then. My name's Lawson Vexley. This is my place." Beatrice stared at his hand for a moment, then took it. It was warm and steady. She followed him through the cold to the house, a modest 2-story cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. Inside, it smelled like stew and pine wood and something safe. Lawson ladled food into a bowl and slid it across the table. She sat, silent, spooning it into her mouth while he watched quietly from across the room. After a long while, he spoke again. "You got a name?" "Beatrice Dunning." He nodded. "You from back east?" "Missouri." "I answered an ad."
It was a mistake.
He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped loosely in his lap. "Was he rough with you?" She met his eyes. "Yes." That was all. Lawson nodded again, then stood. "You can stay here tonight. Spare rooms upstairs. Door locks from the inside." Beatrice's breath hitched. "Thank you." He paused at the stairs. "You run far?" "Far enough." "He will not find me." Lawson did not question her. He just nodded again and left her alone in the kitchen. Upstairs, the room was small but clean. A quilt folded at the end of the bed, a basin with fresh water, a chair by the window. Beatrice locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and let her breath shake out of her chest. She had gotten out. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the wooden floors. Beatrice woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She descended the stairs slowly, unsure if she had overstayed her welcome. Lawson stood at the stove, flipping eggs. "You sleep all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, voice soft. "Better than I have in weeks." He slid a plate toward her.
"Good."
She ate quietly. He poured her coffee. Neither of them said much, but there was a peace in it she had not felt in a long time. After breakfast, Beatrice stood by the door. "I will be on my way," she said. Lawson looked up from the sink. "Where to?" "I do not know yet. Somewhere else." "You got kin?" No, he dried his hands on a towel. Then you better stay here until you do. She blinked. You do not even know me. He looked her straight in the eye. You did not take anything. You cleaned your dish. You told the truth. That is more than most. Beatrice felt something shift in her chest. I can help, she said. With chores. If I stay. His mouth tugged into something close to a smile. All right. They settled into a rhythm. Beatrice swept the floors, fed the chickens, helped with supper. Lawson saw to the cattle, chopped wood, fixed the roof before the first snow came. They worked in quiet companionship, and every day the silence between them grew softer, easier. One evening, Beatrice stood outside watching the sun set over the pasture. Lawson joined her, arms crossed, hat low on his brow. You got a strong way about you, he said. She looked at him. I do not feel strong. You are still here, he said. That counts. She turned to face him fully. Why are you helping me? He looked out toward the horizon. My ma used to say some folks get lost on purpose. Not because they are weak, just because they need something better to find them. And you think you are something better? He looked at her then, his eyes steady and kind. I want to be. Beatrice felt her heart beat louder. He stepped closer. You do not have to be afraid here. She nodded. I know. That night, he lit the fire in the parlor, and she sat beside him with her mending. Their hands brushed once, and neither pulled away. Snow came early that year. Beatrice took to baking bread and reading old newspapers aloud in the evenings. Lawson started fixing up the barn, building new stalls. He said it was for the horses, but she saw the way he watched her gather eggs in the morning, the way he stood just a little closer each night. One afternoon, Beatrice found him in the barn, hammering in new boards. She leaned against the post and watched him work. You build all this yourself? She asked. He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. Every plank. She stepped closer. It is strong. So are you. She held his gaze. You make me feel safe. Lawson set the hammer down. That is all I want. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Beatrice smiled, small but real. You found me in this barn, and I am not letting go. Their hands stayed joined, warm against the cold air. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, something new was growing, solid, quiet, and sure. Lawson laid the last cedar plank across the new stall and wiped the dust from his palms. The scent of sawdust clung to the air, mingling with the faint sharpness of snow melting off the roof. Beatrice stood just outside the barn doors, a basket on her hip, her cheeks flushed from the cold. There's a woman in town who sells seeds, she said while watching the horizon. Said she's kept her garden alive 11 winters. You thinking of putting one in? Lawson asked, resting his weight against the stall rail. Beatrice shifted the basket to her other arm. If I do, I'd want to build it right. Not just dig up a patch and hope. Something that lasts. Lawson nodded once. I've got lumber left. Could help you frame it, come spring. Beatrice glanced sideways, her mouth hinting toward a smile. I'd like that. He watched her a moment longer, then stepped out into the light beside her. The snow had begun to thin across the pasture, revealing patches of brittle grass beneath. Crows circled high, their cries distant. She crouched to lace her boots tighter. Do you ride often? Often enough, he said. Why? I never learned. She stood and brushed her skirt down. When I was a girl, Papa kept our horses for hauling. Said riding was for men or fools. Lawson glanced toward the corral. There's a gelding here named Harlan. Steady on his feet. I could teach you. She hesitated. I don't want to be a burden. You wouldn't be. Beatrice lifted her gaze to meet his. I'd like to try. That afternoon, he saddled the gelding and led him to the yard. Beatrice approached with her shoulders lifted, jaw tight. Lawson stood beside her without touching. Start with your left foot in the stirrup, he said gently. Let yourself lean into him. He won't move. Beatrice placed her boot, gripped the horn, and swung her leg over. She wobbled once but steadied. Her breath came sharp through her nose. Good, Lawson said. Now settle your weight.
Sit-tol.
She nodded, fingers white on the reins. He stepped in beside her, resting a hand lightly on the saddle horn. You all right? Beatrice looked down at him. I don't want to be afraid of things anymore. You're not, he said. You're doing it. They circled the yard slowly, Lawson walking beside her, boots crunching against the thawing ground. Her back straightened with each pass, and by the fifth round, she was guiding the horse herself. When she finally dismounted, her hands trembled, but her eyes were bright. I didn't fall.
You didn't, he said.
You rode. Beatrice looked at the gelding, then at Lawson. Thank you. You don't owe me thanks, he said. You did that on your own. They stood quiet for a while, the wind rustling in the dried grass. Then she spoke softly. Did you always live alone out here? Lawson rubbed the back of his neck. Used to be my brother and me. He left for Oregon 3 years back. Said the winters got too long. And you stayed. Someone had to mind the place. She looked at the house behind them, smoke curling from the chimney. It's a good place. He met her eyes. It feels different now. Beatrice's breath caught. She looked down at her gloves, then slowly removed them, finger by finger. I used to think I was meant to be invisible, quiet enough not to be noticed, agreeable enough not to be left behind. You're not invisible here. She stepped forward. I know. The space between them narrowed. Her hands, bare now, reached for his coat. He didn't move, only watched her with a steady calm. You've been patient with me, she said. You never pressed. I figured you'd reach for what you wanted when you were ready. She looked up at him, the last of the sun catching in her hair. And if I'm reaching now? Lawson's voice dropped low. Then I'm here. Her hands slid up to his shoulders, and he bent his head to kiss her. It was slow, certain, the kind of kiss that asked nothing, but gave everything. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, grounding them both. That night, they sat by the fire, her head tucked beneath his chin, his hand resting over hers. No words passed between them, and none were needed. Outside, the wind had gone still. The snow had stopped. The quiet that followed was not empty, but full of things beginning, of roots taking hold beneath thawing earth. The thaw brought mud deep, clinging muck that turned the road to Fort Benton into a long ribbon of brown ruts and standing water. Beatrice stood at the fence line with a basket on her hip, watching the mountain runoff cut soft gullies along the pasture's edge. She had taken to walking the perimeter most mornings, checking for breaks in the wire or signs of wolves, though she'd yet to see one. Lawson called to her from the porch, a folded letter in his hand. Ryder left this just now. From town. She crossed the yard, brushing her palms on her apron. Did he say who it's from? He didn't. Lawson handed it to her and stepped aside, giving her space. The paper bore no return name, only a smudged postmark and a shaky scrawl. She opened it slowly, heart tightening as her eyes scanned the page. A single line stood out above the rest. I know where you are. Lawson read the change in her face. Tell me. Beatrice folded the letter once, then again, until it disappeared in her fist. It's him. Lawson didn't speak right away. He looked out over the pasture, jaw set.
How?
He must have followed the train records. My name was listed on the passenger manifest. He nodded slowly. He'd have to ride days to get this far. Beatrice stared at the ground. He'll come. Lawson's voice was even. Then he'll find I'm not the kind of man who lets harm cross my threshold. She looked up at him. I don't want you hurt on my account. You're not a burden. He took the letter from her hand and slipped it into his coat. We'll be ready. Beatrice spent the next few days in quiet preparation. She refilled the root cellar, mended the hinges on the back gate, stacked kindling near every stove. The air was heavy with the waiting, and though Lawson didn't say much, she noticed he began saddling his horse before breakfast and riding the edge of the property at dusk with his rifle across his saddle. One evening, as she set the table, she asked, "Did you ever lose someone?" He poured water into the tin cups. "I did." She sat, folding her hands in her lap. "Was it someone you still think of?" His eyes stayed on the glass for a long moment. "My brother left, but he didn't write. Not once. I reckon that's its own kind of loss." Beatrice nodded. "Sometimes it's the ones still walking this earth that leave the deepest ache." Lawson looked across the table at her. "You carrying more than just what he did to you?" She hesitated. "When I was 16, I told a man no.
He didn't like that.
Afterwards, folks called me difficult. Said I must have led him on. My parents sent me to live with an aunt. I never went home." He didn't look away. "That wasn't your shame to bear." "I know that now," she said, voice steady. "But I didn't for a long time." The stove crackled behind them. Wind brushed the shutters. "You deserve real peace," Lawson said. She met his eyes. "I'm beginning to find it here." The next morning, a stranger on horseback appeared at the far end of the field. Beatrice saw him from the upstairs window and called down. Lawson stepped onto the porch, rifle resting in the crook of his arm. The rider didn't dismount. He stayed just beyond the fence line, hat pulled low. Even from a distance, Beatrice recognized the set of his shoulders. Lawson walked down slow, boots steady in the mud. "You lost." The man spat into the grass. "I'm looking for something that belongs to me." Lawson didn't move an inch. "Ain't nothing here fits that description. She's my wife. She left you. That's all I need to know." The man's lip curled. "You think you can hide her behind some barn and a rifle?" "She's not hiding. And she's not yours." Lawson shifted his stance. "You got 10 seconds to ride on." The man's hand twitched near his belt, but he saw Lawson's fingers already on the trigger guard. After a long pause, he clicked his tongue and turned the horse. Beatrice watched him disappear down the road, her breath frozen in her chest. She came down the stairs slow, hands braced against the rail. "He's gone," Lawson said when she opened the door. "But he'll try the sheriff next." Beatrice stepped outside, wind tugging at her skirts. "Then I'll go with you to town. I'll swear out a statement. It could turn ugly." "I've lived ugly," she said. "I won't live afraid." At the courthouse, she stood in front of a gray-bearded judge and told her story without trembling. Lawson stood beside her, silent but solid as a foundation. When she finished, the judge nodded once and said, "That man won't be troubling you again. Not legally." On the ride home, Beatrice leaned into Lawson's side as the wagon bumped over frozen ruts. "You didn't have to stay," she said. "I didn't have to," he agreed. "But I wanted to." She looked up at him. "So did I." The sun broke through the clouds then, a soft gold across the ridges. The road behind them was long and rutted. The one ahead was still muddy, still uncertain, but it was theirs. That night, after supper, Beatrice lit a lamp and set it by the bed. She turned and found Lawson in the doorway, watching her with quiet certainty. "I don't want to sleep alone tonight," she said. He crossed the room, slow and sure, and reached for her hand. "Then you won't." She leaned into his chest, and he held her like she was the only thing he'd ever wanted to keep. Outside, snow started again, fine flakes catching in the eaves. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, warming the corners of a house that no longer held just one heart, but two. The creek behind Lawson's house had risen with the snow melt, running swift and glassy beneath the cottonwoods. Beatrice stood on a flat stone by the edge, Her skirts lifted slightly above her boots as she watched tufts of ice bob downstream like pale lily leaves. Her hands were bare, sleeves rolled to the elbows from scrubbing the floor earlier, and her breath rose in thin clouds around her face. Lawson approached with a coil of fence wire over one shoulder and a post maul in hand. He stopped when he saw her by the water, then set the tools down quietly and stepped beside her. "I saw rabbit tracks near the shed," he said. "You want to set a snare tomorrow?" She bent down, dipped her fingers into the icy current, and wiped them on her apron. "I'd like that. I never learned much about trapping." "You'll pick it up quick." Beatrice looked at him. "You always know how to fill the quiet." Lawson gave a brief glance toward the sky. "Only when it's worth filling." She sat on the stone, smoothing her palms over her lap. "I keep thinking about what I'll make of myself here." "You've already made more than most." He sat beside her, the stone cool beneath them. "You want something beyond this?" "I want to belong to something good, not just survive it." She turned toward him, eyes steady. "I used to think safety came from obedience. Now, I think it comes from understanding." Lawson picked up a pebble and sent it skipping across the water. "A man's worth more by what he understands than what he controls." Beatrice rested her chin on her knees. "Did you always think that?"
No.
"Took too long to learn it." She studied him. "What changed you?" He traced the grain in the stone between them with one finger. "I was 13 when my father died. My brother was 17 and thought he had to be twice the man to make up for it. He started telling, not asking. I followed for a while. Then I didn't." Beatrice nodded once. "You don't carry the weight of someone else's pride." "I carry enough of my own." The wind shifted, stirring the bare branches overhead. Beatrice's voice dropped. "If I wanted to build a garden near the south fence, where the sun stays longer, would that trouble the cattle?" Lawson's mouth twitched in thought. "Not if we run a second rail between the posts."
Keep it boxed in.
"I can help dig it proper." She smiled faintly. "I want it to last." "It will." They sat there until the cold settled deeper into the stone, then stood and walked back toward the house, their shoulders brushing once, neither speaking of it. That night, Beatrice lit the lamp above the kitchen table and drew a rough sketch of the garden rows on a scrap of butcher paper. She used a piece of charcoal from a hearth and kept her lines clean and straight. Lawson watched from the chair near the door, mending a tear in his coat sleeve. "You planning to grow tobacco in that corner?" he asked, nodding toward the sketch. "Chamomile." She didn't look up. "I like the way it smells when it dries." He pulled the thread through with one long stroke. "You ever think about raising chickens again? You've got the knack." "I'd like hens that don't peck each other to pieces." "There's a man in Fort Shaw sells Orpingtons. Mild-tempered." Beatrice looked over her shoulder. "You'd ride all the way there just for hens?" "For the right ones." She returned to her drawing. "I've never had a spring that felt like it belonged to me." Lawson set the coat aside and crossed the space between them. "You do now." She turned to him, fingers still dusted with charcoal. "I believe you." He reached out, brushing a smudge of black from her cheek with his thumb. "You planning to stay?" She met his eyes. "I already have." They stood that way for a moment, the lamp casting long amber shadows across the floorboards, the quiet between them full but unspoken. Later that week, they hitched the wagon and rode to a neighboring homestead, where an older widow was selling off tools and supplies. Beatrice bartered for seed sacks and a rusted kettle, her voice low but sure. Lawson stood beside her, arms folded, offering no correction and no guidance, only presence. On the ride back, she traced the hem of a flour sack resting on her lap. "That woman had a way of looking at me like she saw something I hadn't named." Lawson kept his eyes on the road. "Maybe she did." Beatrice leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. "I want to grow things that wouldn't have survived where I came from." "You will." The wagon creaked over a ridge, and their land stretched out ahead, the house small against the wide sky, smoke trailing from its chimney like a steady breath. At the gate, Lawson helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist just a moment longer than needed. She didn't step away. Inside, she put the seeds in a tin box and placed it on the shelf beside the coffee tin. She didn't look at him as she did it, but her voice was clear. "I don't want this to be something we name later." Lawson crossed the threshold, closed the door behind him. "It's already named." She turned then, and he stepped into her space, hands cupping her face, as if anchoring her there. They kissed, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of something rooted deep. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his chest. "I want to build the rest of my life from this place." "We will." Outside, the earth began to soften underfoot. The frost was gone from the eaves. And inside, the shape of their life together was beginning to take form, slow, deliberate, and lasting. The wind that came with late April was higher and cleaner than it had been, sweeping the last of winter's grip from the timberline and sending the loose ends of Beatrice's braid over her shoulder as she leaned over the garden bed. Her palms were gritty with soil, the sleeves of her dress rolled past her elbows. She pressed the heel of her hand into the earth, firming a row of cabbage starts with practiced care. Lawson knelt nearby, setting the last cedar rail into place around the garden's perimeter. He tapped it secure with a hammer, then leaned back on his heels, watching her. "Lines are straight," he said, brushing sawdust from his hands. Beatrice sat back, stretching her arms overhead. "I marked them with twine last night. Used the lantern to check the angles." "I noticed." He nodded toward the house. "You had a light going past midnight. I couldn't sleep." She stood and wiped her hands on a cloth. "There's a kind of rest that comes only when something's done right." "I needed that." Lawson stood with her. "You've made this something, right?" She looked up at him. "I wasn't sure I still knew how." He reached out, brushing a fleck of dirt from her cheekbone with the pad of his thumb. "You do." The sun hung low behind the barn, casting long shadows across the tilled rows. A meadowlark called from the fence line, and Beatrice turned toward the sound, her expression shifting. "I got a letter yesterday," she said, "from my cousin Ruth. She heard through a neighbor in Missouri that I'd come west. She's in Miles City now, working at a mercantile." Lawson waited, arms at his sides. "She wants to visit. Said she'd come by coach next month if I'd have her." Beatrice looked up. "I think I want her to see what I've made of myself." "She'll see more than that," Lawson said. "She'll see someone who kept going when most would have laid down." Beatrice exhaled slowly. "I'd like her to know that this life is real. That it wasn't just something I ran toward out of desperation. She'll see it's where you were meant to be." At dusk, they sat on the porch, a shared plate of fried cornmeal cakes between them. Beatrice rested her feet on the step, her knee brushing his, and watched the chickens settle on their roost through the slats of the coop. "She's laying again," she said, nodding toward the speckled hen near the gate. "I wasn't sure she would after the cold snap." "Some things surprise you," Lawson said, his voice low. Beatrice turned toward him. "You do." He tilted his head. "How's that?" "I thought I'd be grateful just to be safe. But with you, I'm more than safe. I'm seen." Lawson didn't speak. He took her hand in his, rough fingers curling around hers, and she leaned into his side. They spent the next weeks building the life they'd begun in pieces. Beatrice traded with a woman in Eagle Rock for soap and flour, exchanging her own stitching for supplies. Lawson repaired the roof of the smokehouse and added a second trough to the corral. Their days folded into each other like pages in a well-kept ledger, nothing wasted, everything held with care. One morning, a man from the township rode out to offer Lawson work assisting with spring roundup further west. Beatrice stood at the gate as they spoke, arms crossed lightly, watching the way Lawson's posture shifted. After the man left, she joined him by the fence. "You thinking of riding with them?" Only if it doesn't take me far. 3 days out at most. She nodded once. You've got a good hand with animals. They know it. He turned to her. I won't go if you'd rather I stay. I'd never ask you to turn from what you're made for. She reached for his collar, smoothing it flat. Just promise to come home with the same eyes and hands you're leaving with. He kissed her forehead. I promise. When he returned, dusty and sunburnt, she met him at the road with 2 tin cups of cool water and a basin waiting inside. That night, they lay in bed with the windows open, the scent of sage drifting in, and Beatrice's head resting over his heartbeat. I want to marry you, she said into the dark. His arm tightened around her. I was waiting for the right moment to ask, he said, voice warm against her crown. But I like yours better. They married in early June, under a cottonwood near the creek. Ruth arrived 2 days before, bearing a small parcel of polished bone buttons and a smile that faltered only once when she saw how deeply Lawson looked at Beatrice. You seem different, Ruth said as they walked together the morning of the ceremony. I am. Beatrice bent down to pull a weed from between the basil shoots. I was always told I'd have to choose between being strong and being loved. But I've found both here. Ruth squeezed her hand. Then you've found something rare. The service was quiet. 3 neighbors came, and Ruth set out a basket of bread and pickled carrots on the table outside. Lawson wore his cleanest shirt, the sleeves rolled once at the forearm, and Beatrice wore a dress she'd let down herself, the hem falling just to her boots. When he took her hands and spoke his vows, his voice was clear and steady. You're the only thing I ever chose with both hands. I'll carry you through the hard days, and I'll be still beside you on the good ones. Beatrice's eyes didn't waver. You gave me a place to be whole. I'll give you a life that's honest and warm. They did not dance, but they sat long into the evening with hands clasped under the table, watching the sun settle behind the ridgeline. By autumn, the garden had grown full and unruly. Beatrice began drying herbs in bunches from the rafters and stitching winter garments with the wool they'd traded for in late August. Lawson carved a cradle from pine, though no child yet filled it. One evening, as they shelled peas by lantern light, Beatrice looked up, her fingers still. I want to raise children here, she said, where the air smells clean and no one tells them to shrink. Lawson looked at her, quiet for a moment. Then we'll do just that. They spent the winter preparing, not out of fear but readiness. Beatrice planted bulbs for spring, and Lawson laid stones for a path to the barn so she wouldn't slip when the snows came. They laughed often, fought rarely, and when they did, it was brief and without cruelty. The kind of life they built was stitched from small things. A warm mug passed into hands without asking, a coat hung dry before the other remembered the rain. Years passed, and the land grew richer beneath their work. Beatrice kept a ledger of every harvest, and Lawson taught their children to mend fences and listen to the wind. They grew old together, not in silence, but in a peace that spoke without words. And in every season that followed, through blizzards and births, through loss and late summers heavy with peaches, they never once forgot what it cost them to find each other or how wholly they belonged.